Hi, my name is Lori Fazzino, and today I'm here to talk about the Every Student Succeeds Act, or the ESSA. So let's just start with what is ESSA? The Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA, is federal legislation signed into law by President Obama in December of 2015. But the implementation of this act did not occur until 2017. It is the latest reauthorization of the 1965 Elementary and Secondary Education Act, or the ESEA. And that act later became the more well known No Child Left Behind Act. Now, the ESSA situates power in the hands of states and school districts to make decisions regarding things like testing, teacher quality, and solutions for fixing failing schools. There have been notable changes to education policy with the implementation of ESSA. However, some requirements have remained the same from the previous No Child Left Behind legislation. And so let's dive into the historical background. Like I mentioned, the ESSA is the most recent education legislation that emerged from a long line of education legislation beginning in the 1960s. And so I think it's important to take a look at the pioneers of education legislation in the United States, and I'm just going to cover the highlights. And so in 1965, President Johnson helped develop the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, or the ESEA. And this was a way to combat poverty through funding the education. The ESEA also became part of civil rights law. In 1978, President Carter reauthorized the ESEA and directed funding towards schools and districts with the greatest number of students living in poverty. And so let's fast forward to 2001, where the ESEA was reauthorized once again under President Bush, but this time through the No Child Left Behind Act. No Child Left Behind was reauthorized in 2007, but in 2010 it was deemed unworkable. And that brings us to the ESSA, which was signed into law by President Obama in 2015 with overwhelming bipartisan support. You can see 85 members of Congress voted for this law. So progress has been made. And let's look at the current perspective and really dive into what ESSA is. And so, like I've mentioned, the ESSA reduces federal authority over school decisions and gives power back to the states and the local school districts. But this doesn't mean it's the wild, wild west out there. States must still give tests every year, beginning in grade 3 and going up to grade 8. And they must also do so once in high school. They must report the results as well as report the per pupil expenditure. States are still required to have academic standards, but the federal government cannot dictate or suggest what these standards should be. And teacher accountability is able to now be determined by the state or the school district. School accountability goes past just test scores and must now include a non academic measure like school climate or absenteeism. Schools are, however, required to intervene in the lowest performing schools. And so, what does this all mean? What are the nuts and bolts? Well, let's talk teacher quality. So, where the No Child Left Behind Act evaluated teachers strictly based on test scores, the ESSA looks at a broader range of factors to determine if learning is actually taking place. And speaking of testing, under the ESSA, there's more flexibility regarding the actual tests. And so, for example, in high schools can use state exams or other tests like the SAT or the ACT. Now, what's really interesting to me is that a handful of states can actually experiment with new or alternative testing. Now, in terms of transparency, the scores, the results, and also the per pupil expenditure, these are readily available to parents. And there's a greater amount of transparency in the testing methods and the results. There are school report cards and state report cards. Now, let's talk failing schools. States are still required to fix the bottom 5% of schools and schools with high dropout rates. However, under ESSA, schools can determine themselves how to solve these problems rather than just lose their funding if they are underperforming. Under ESSA, resources are allocated to the schools who need it the most. And so let's talk strengths and weaknesses of the policy. We're going to talk about the good, we're going to talk about the bad. And so, strengths of ESA include broader measures of school performance. So, like I said, things like absenteeism and school climate. It takes the pressure imposed from federal governments off of the public schools. And like I mentioned, there is more flexibility in actual testing. The ESSA promotes innovation among school districts and schools. And like I said, there's greater transparency in the reporting. There's also more investment. The ESSA expands investment in preschool education. And there's a preschool development grant that's for low income families to start good quality early childhood education under this act. Now, in terms of some of the weaknesses, well, the degree of change is really just left up to the states. And there is no national standard or curriculum. So, really, there's really no sort of continuity among the states. The ESSA, while it does allocate resources to the schools that need it the most, it does not address the root causes of inequality. And it does not stop school closures in low income communities, which actually hurt the most vulnerable students. And some criticism of the ESSA has been that there is still too much federal oversight, and this criticism comes from members of Congress who did not vote for this bill. And so that's the ESSA in a nutshell. And I think my thoughts on the ESSA is that it is a step in the right direction, and I think only time is going to tell just how effective it can be. So here are my references, and thanks so much for watching.